Welcome back. Gmax 1.2 for the beginning modeler, video number 35. What I wanted to do in this video was just kind of wrap up the animation of the gear parts, small part on the main gear, and kind of discuss some miscellaneous things to kind of wrap everything we've done so far and introduce to you the landing light addition. So my name is Milton Shupe, and we've come a long way here, as you can see, and made a lot of progress. We've used a lot of tools. You should be comfortable with those tools now. So let's just wrap up the main and nose gear build and animation process, and then we'll talk about a few other things, and that'll be a wrap for today. Alrighty, since the last video, I figured instead of going through the process of fleshing out this upper boom and lower wheel well area for the main, I'll just pull in those parts from my other project to save some time, some video time, especially because it's really nothing that you haven't done so far in terms of just pushing vertices around and creating shapes. So you can see here I've kind of rounded and fattened this out as we have to accommodate this wheel up here, and same thing on the bottom. And that's just a lot of working with retracting the gear and turning it up in there to hide it, and making sure we build a mesh around it to hide it correctly. And you can see the animation here where I open the doors and then the main gear comes down. Notice it's flat up in there for storage to keep that frontal area and the drag associated with it very small. And then we kind of sneak it out of there real close to the doors, bring down the gear guard in the front with it, rotate the tire back around to straight ahead, and then we get into our suspension animation. So let me explain to you a little bit about that part. The only thing I did on this lower gear, once we were ready to do this part here, is I added a keyframe. Normally the suspension animation on the lower gear is animated between 100 and 200. Well, because when the gear is retracting and extending, this lower gear has to be twisted, turned, rotated, if you will, to fit up in this wheel well. I added a keyframe over here on like 15 or 16. And so in the normal area where we have the gear extending, the upper gear, 0 to 100, I added the keyframe so that we could start rotation of the lower gear and the wheel and tire in this 15 to 100 area. And that's basically all I did there. So it's just a matter of adding that keyframe in an area that you don't typically see for the lower gear, whose suspension is meant to be animated between 100 and 200. So that's all you have to do with that. And you might think that's kind of difficult, swinging that up in there just right and getting it settled, but it's not as hard as you think. Once you get this mesh built and it's comfortable fitting the tire, then you can go into the bottom here, and if you either go into see-through or wireframe, you can see how it fits in there and where it belongs. So once you get that positioned in there correctly and ready to animate, all you have to do is add this keyframe here and go to this position and click on the Animate, and then go ahead and let your main gear rotate down on the upper gear, and then reposition the wheel so that it's pointing straight ahead back to its original. Now what I did when I rotated it up there and fitted it is I recorded the the degrees of rotation that was required so I could bring it down precisely and get it straight forward again. Let's see. What local here? So I had it rotated, see, 79.16 degrees. So when I came back down to 100, it looks like I'm 0.016 off, but whatever that relates to, it's minute anyhow, but that should be 0. So if you do that correctly, kind of unlike I did, you can get that tire back down and facing straight ahead. Not really noticeable in the sim, 0.016 of a degree essentially. So and the sim obviously doesn't care, but because this could be a brick flying, the sim doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to the sim. But anyhow, that's the way I address that, so not a big deal there. Now, a few other things I wanted to point out. With the gear all done now, doors animated, is I wanted to follow up on these rudder trim tabs back here. I think I failed to mention they were automated. I mean, they were animated using lever trim tab rudder key. And when you go looking at the SDK and trying to figure out what to use to animate these trim tabs, it's kind of confusing because the things that you think they aren't. If you use the straight trim tab, the thing will rotate around 4, 5, 6 times as you're rotating your rudder trim. So like that doesn't work. But I discovered over time that the lever trim tab rudder key is the one that you can use. I think it was really meant for something in the virtual cockpit, but you see that it rotates on the x-axis, so it's kind of strange. It's like it was meant for something in the BC. It should really be rotating on the z-axis, but whatever. This is the way that it works, and it's animated on keyframes 0, 50, and 100. So 0 to the left, 50 is straight, and 100 is to the right, as you can see it. Straight there and then to the right there, and that's the way you animate those trim tabs on the rudder. And that's the only trim tab that you have to. Let's see, I think that's correct anyhow. Let me just double check. Oops. No, yeah, that's correct. Trim tab elevator, the sim animates. So all you have to do is place the pivot in the right place, and as we did over here, and it's ready to go. So that's kind of it for the trim tabs. One other thing that I added was the landing light. The landing light has its own little peculiarities, and let's see if we can jump in on it here. This landing light, when selected, you can see that there are keyframes 0 to 100. It's animated pretty much just like your top gear is animated 0 to 100 to extend. So 0 is retracted and 100 is extended, and you have to use this landing underscore light underscore left or right, and I usually follow it with an underscore number. So you got to pick. There's several parts here, but you got to pick one that works. I happen to pick the frame, this frame right here, to animate. Then I attached texture to the front of it, kind of like a light beam, and kind of a bracket in the back to kind of look like it's retracting with that bracket, but whatever. That's what it's all about. Pretty simple to do. And there's one other part on here that we don't want to fail to mention. You can see it right here, this little, if I can click on it here, maybe I can, maybe I can't. And I I've got too much competition in the background. Let's see if I can get it this way. Alright. This is just a plane. Remember, in your standard primitives, you have an object type plane. Just create a plane for that. And in FS9, you don't even have to texture it. You just give it a color, a light color. That's all you need. And it has to be attached to, well, something in the back of it. The animation and the workings of this depends on these two parts. This part tells the sim where the center of that light is going to be positioned. And it needs to be out in front of this lens a little bit, otherwise it will get partially covered up. So position it out there an inch or so in front of the lens, and just center the pivot on it and line the world is fine. The pivot that really makes a difference is the parent pivot, which I called the light lens behind it. And if we can look at that pivot, you'll notice, let's go to the local one because that's the one that matters. You notice on that pivot that the z-axis is pointing to the rear, and this is a strange way to do this, but that's the way it's. I know that's hard to see. I'm trying to help you out here, but I'm not being too successful. Let's see. You can see the z-axis is pointing opposite the direction of the beam. Why they did that, I don't know, but that's the way it has to be. So when you set up your parent of the light beam point light here, link it to your lens or whatever is behind it, and then go into local mode and effect pivot only, and set this pivot so that the z-axis is pointing opposite of the beam direction. That's the best I can tell you. I can't explain it, but that's the way it's got to work. So I hope that's helpful. All right, let's see. What, we essentially have the exterior done now. We haven't done anything in the cockpit, but I do that on the virtual cockpit side. But essentially have this done. Now, we went through the exercise of exporting this once before, but it didn't have gear on it. Now that we have gear, then we need to, now's a good time, it's a good break before you move on to, let's see, turn on the grid here, to get data for your aircraft config. We need all kinds of data. We need the pilot's eye point or viewpoint, so that when you go to the virtual cockpit, you're looking out over the, through the windshield at the proper place, and left and right and up and down, etc. So we need to collect that eye point data or view data. I think it's in a section called views in the parameters eye point. So you get your XYZ coordinates for that. The next thing we'll get is gear data. Where is this gear located relative to both the Gmax and the FS reference points? So everything in the aircraft config is done based on your reference to the FS reference point. And in my case, I always make them the same just for simplicity reasons, but they can be different. So in the next video, I'm going to come back and tell you how to collect all this data, your contact point data, how to calculate your suspension movement, and translate that into a good looking, good working suspension. We'll need things like your engine location. What it's really asking for in FS9 is what is your prop or your thrust location in relative to the reference point. So we capture that data. Then of course we have wing lights. And why guess at it when you can go right here and click on the, we could put a bulb in there too, but if you just click on this, all of your coordinates are down here to the bottom. So we'll record those coordinates, convert them to feet, and update the sim with that. So those are the kinds of data that we're going to be capturing in the next video, and I'll show you how to translate that, put it into the aircraft config. And there's other things like fuel tanks, etc. So we'll go through that process, and I'll show you how to transfer that into the aircraft config and get you ready to set up your lights and gear, your suspension, etc. Even crash points if you want to do that by selecting vertices from various places on the aircraft. So we'll do that in the next video, and we'll have you flying here with an aircraft config that matches up with your dimensions and locations of things on your aircraft. So I hope this video was helpful and instructional, and if you'd like to post comments, put them down below, and I'll look to see you back on the next video. Thanks for joining.